I think we have important issues we have to discuss. As a community, I think we have important issues we have to discuss as a society. As you all know, in the last couple of days, our community experienced a couple of tragedies. Those tragedies were clearly unimaginable, unforgettable, similar but singular. 3 families were devastated, and the issues themselves continue. I want to talk a little bit about the families. I just want them to know that on behalf of the city, on behalf of public safety, that our community really will support you. You are part of us. You belong to us. You're part of our community. There will be many people who want to reach out to you. I know that will be the case. And we would ask that if you have any kinds of needs, that you feel free to speak up. This is something that's very, very important for you to think about. I also want to talk about our community. I've heard over and over again, and I've heard from many other people, that our community was quite traumatized. This is something that's quite unusual. These events unfolded within a matter of hours, and because of these kinds of events, our community is now in a significant amount of pain. And I want to let our community know that there's going to be a lot of follow-up in terms of trying to determine what we can help in terms of the helping you all to work through these issues. There will be a gathering in the not too distant future, perhaps some kind of candlelight vigil, and we want everybody to attend as much as possible. I also want to say that I've lived in this community for many years, and I know of the abundance that this community has. I know the gifts that many people have in this community. I know of the spirit of kindness and care that this community has, and has for a long time. I know of the amount of humanity that exists between people and amongst people in this community. It's in abundance. And those are the things I think we need to focus on. I know you from the media. I understand that these emotional, dramatic moments can kind of carry the day, but I also think that the dignity and the wholeness of people in the community carry a much bigger part, and it's something we need to focus on from this point forward. And so again, I thank you all for being here today. One of the underlying concerns, as we're seeing them in both of these cases, I'm just going to say, is mental illness. We're concerned about the issue of mental illness in our community. In fact, I think our entire country should be concerned, and probably is, around the issue of mental illness. I think I can speak for every police chief and sheriff in this country who says that they devote a tremendous amount of resources to responding to calls for service that involve mental illness. And it's something that we don't know why, but seems to be becoming more frequent. And it's something that, you know, how we've been trying to address it, I think, is something we need to look at differently. I think the conversations need to change dramatically. I think we need to shift our thinking in terms of how we address mental illness in our communities. I can assure you, in Longmont, that's where we're headed. Mental illness is something that probably strikes everybody. I doubt if there's a person here who doesn't know somebody, a family member, a relative, a neighbor, or a friend who's not suffering from mental illness. It's prevalent. It's something that we can no longer hide. The stigma of mental illness is something that we need to eliminate. Many people who have mental illness hide in the shadows of our communities. They feel like they don't belong. And you know, and the fact is, when we look at folks who have mental illness, we actually call them a problem. We say that person is mentally ill. We don't acknowledge the gifts or the strengths or the assets of people who have mental illness, but yet they do. And because we have marginalized them at some level, the gifts they have never make it to the center. And so I know the issue of mental illness is pervasive in our community, but our community is not unique. And the message I want to send is that we do need to change the conversation. We do need to shift how we're approaching mental illness in our community. Now, I will say that there is a certain amount of public funding that goes to service providers that deal with mental illness in every community. But I will also say, let me back up and say that I know many service providers, and I know that they do the best job they can with the resources they have. But in the final analysis, the amount of public funding we have for mental illness is about this big. The problem is this big. And so how do we address that? How do we begin to either lessen the problem or enlarge the resources? That's the only two ways I can see. And the fact of the matter is we're probably not going to enlarge public funding resources too much. All of you know about the incidents in Newtown and the Aurora Theater. The issue of mental illness became big after both of those events. Many people talked about it. News stations kept it up for the broadcast media, the print media talked about it for about a month. And then it seemed to kind of go away. And so what we can't have anymore is a temporary, kind of momentary response and focus with mental illness. It's something we need to deal with on a more consistent, sustainable basis. Or else we're going to continue to confront issues like we're confronting every day in this community and every other community is confronting every day as well. And so my thoughts on this, and I've shared these with my colleagues, is that we need to figure out how to get our community much more engaged. And we do have resources in our community that can come to the surface and would be willing to work at a much different level. We in government and our service providers in mental illness, in the mental health field, have to acknowledge that we cannot do this by ourselves anymore. And so that's something, that's part of the conversation that's going to have to shift. Another part of the conversation that's going to have to shift is that we can no longer allow these folks who are struggling with mental illness to exist in the shadows and the margins. We have to invite them in to our community. We have to embrace them. They have to know that they belong to our community. They have to know that their gifts, their assets, and their strengths are important for our community. We have to quit labeling people as mentally ill. We have to identify them by who they are as people. And so we have to develop a comfort zone for all of us. The other part that needs to shift is that we need to stop being afraid. We need to stop being afraid of people who do suffer from mental illness. I understand that we just don't know a lot about it. I understand the stigma. I understand that there's something there that perhaps is unknown. And with all those factors, sometimes we can become fearful. Well, we need to figure out how not to be fearful and afraid anymore. And on top of all that, we need to figure out how to galvanize, convene, and bring together all the community resources we have, way beyond public funding. We have to figure out how to change the perception that we have around mental illness, and we have to figure out how to become one community, including those people who struggle with mental illness. Now, I can sit here and use the phrase, it takes a community to raise a child, to deal with other issues like homelessness, like addiction, like poverty, but it's going to take a community to deal with mental illness. And that's just the bottom line. And so part of my frustration or part of my passion or part of something that I want to be able to do in the future in my role here as the public safety chief is to be able to invite and challenge our community to come forward in a way that we can begin to have community-wide conversations. And that those conversations can lead to a more broad, comprehensive awareness, consciousness, and solution around how we're dealing with the issue of mental illness. I'm pretty convinced that if we could do something like that, and we could begin to change the perception that we have of mental illness, and we could begin to look at people who struggle with mental illness as people who do have gifts, that we could begin to address this issue at a significantly greater level. And that's something that I think we all need to be thinking about.